The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas has long been one of the most violent and powerful white supremacist prison gangs in the United States. Founded in the early 1980s within the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the ABT emerged from racial tensions and the need for protection and power behind bars. As its ranks grew, the gang extended its influence beyond prison walls, becoming deeply involved in organized crime, including drug trafficking, extortion, and murder. The ABT's rise has been marked by bloody conflicts, both with rival gangs such as the Mexican Mafia, Texas Syndicate, and Black Guerrilla Family, and within its own ranks through internal power struggles. These gang wars have left a trail of violence across Texas, both in correctional facilities and on the streets. This introduction examines the origins, motivations, and major incidents that have shaped the ABT's history of conflict and domination in the criminal underworld. Number 6. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas versus Texas Syndicate Gang. The gang war between the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, ABT, and the Texas Syndicate during the 1990s and 2000s was one of the most violent and sustained conflicts in the Texas prison system. Rooted in racial division, economic competition, and the struggle for dominance over prison units and the narcotics trade, the rivalry between these two powerful gangs resulted in numerous assaults, murders, and long-term security crackdowns by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, TDCJ. The Texas Syndicate, TS, meanwhile, was one of the oldest Hispanic prison gangs in the state. Formed in the 1970s by Texas inmates who sought protection from California-based gangs, the syndicate evolved into a tightly controlled criminal organization that demanded loyalty, secrecy, and obedience. By the 1990s, TS controlled large portions of the drug trade in various Texas prisons and had extended its operations to the streets, particularly in South Texas and urban areas like Houston and San Antonio. The gang war between the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas and the Texas Syndicate was sparked by overlapping criminal interests and increasing tension in units such as the Caulfield, Allred, and Estelle units. Control over the lucrative prison drug trade, extortion of weaker inmates, and black market goods led to inevitable conflict. As the ABT sought to expand its influence into areas historically dominated by Hispanic gangs, confrontations with the Texas Syndicate became unavoidable. Violence erupted in a series of retaliatory attacks beginning in the early 1990s. ABT members targeted TS inmates with stabbings and beatings, often attempting to assert dominance through sheer brutality. The Texas Syndicate, known for its own disciplined and violent responses, retaliated with equal ferocity. Fights between the two gangs often involved coordinated assaults using homemade weapons such as shanks, steel rods, and sharpened toothbrushes. One notable flashpoint occurred in 1996 at the McConnell unit, where multiple inmates were hospitalized following a large-scale brawl between ABT and TS members. This clash was reportedly over a disagreement related to the heroin trade and a stolen drug shipment. In the years that followed, similar incidents occurred at other maximum security prisons, prompting TDCJ to begin isolating known gang leaders and implementing more rigorous gang classification and separation policies. Despite their opposing racial ideologies, the conflict between ABT and TS was less about hate and more about power and profit. Both gangs understood the value of controlling narcotics inside prisons. Whoever controlled the supply lines held influence over inmates and profited from outside connections. These criminal enterprises became more sophisticated during the 2000s, with the ABT forming smuggling networks involving corrupt staff and using coded communications to direct criminal activity from within prison walls. The Texas Syndicate mirrored this structure with its own deep-rooted contacts and street-level crews. Outside prison, the gang war also spilled onto the streets. In cities like Austin, Houston, and Corpus Christi, ABT and TS members clashed over control of local drug markets and enforcement operations. Drive-by shootings, home invasions, and revenge killings marked the escalation of hostilities beyond prison gates. The violence caught the attention of federal authorities, leading to a series of indictments in the mid-2000s. The war between the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas and the Texas Syndicate gradually diminished by the late 2000s, largely due to increased law enforcement pressure, gang injunctions, and internal fractures within both organizations. Nevertheless, the legacy of the conflict remains a stark example of how racial identity, criminal ambition, and prison power struggles can drive long-term violence in and out of custody. The ABT-TS gang war is remembered as one of the most impactful rivalries in Texas prison history, shaping policies, intensifying gang monitoring efforts, and illustrating the deadly consequences of unchecked organized crime behind bars. Number 5. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas versus Barrio Azteca Gang. Between the 2000s and 2010, a fierce gang war erupted between the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, ABT, and Barrio Azteca, two of the most violent and organized prison gangs operating in the state. While many prison gang conflicts are driven by racial hostility or ideological differences, this war was largely motivated by control over drug trafficking, extortion rackets, and smuggling routes along the Texas-Mexico border. The result was a deadly rivalry that spanned from Texas prisons to border cities like El Paso and Juarez, leaving a trail of bloodshed both inside and outside prison walls. Barrio Azteca, on the other hand, was a ruthless and highly organized gang that originated in Texas prisons in the late 1980s. Comprised primarily of Mexican-American and Mexican nationals, Barrio Azteca quickly rose to prominence through its ties to the Juarez cartel. By the early 2000s, the gang had become deeply involved in cross-border drug trafficking, smuggling cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine into the United States through the El Paso Ciudad Juarez corridor. The conflict between ABT and Barrio Azteca began when their drug trafficking operations started to overlap in both prison and street markets. In units such as the Caulfield, Stiles, and Connolly units, both gangs had established influence and were deeply embedded in prison-based narcotics distribution. Tensions erupted when ABT members began muscling into heroin and methamphetamine trade traditionally dominated by Barrio Azteca. Fights over control of commissary contraband, visitation-based drug drops, and internal distribution networks sparked waves of retaliatory violence. The racial component of the conflict also played a role. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, while primarily motivated by criminal enterprise, still adhered to white supremacist beliefs. Many ABT members viewed Latino gangs, including Barrio Azteca, as both economic rivals and racial enemies. Barrio Azteca, in contrast, focused more on territorial control and alliance with Mexican cartels, particularly the Juarez cartel. Their cartel backing gave them access to high-grade narcotics and weapons, elevating their threat level in the eyes of the ABT. By the mid-2000s, the feud escalated into organized assaults, stabbings, and even murders. ABT hit squads carried out targeted attacks on suspected Barrio Azteca members in prison yards and cell blocks. In response, Barrio Azteca retaliated with its own brand of violence, ambushes, beatings, and retaliatory hits that often left correctional staff scrambling to contain the chaos. One of the most violent flare-ups occurred in 2008 at the Stiles unit, where multiple inmates were injured in coordinated gang-related attacks over drug territory disputes. The violence extended beyond prison walls. In border cities like El Paso and across West Texas, members of both gangs clashed over street-level narcotics markets. Drive-by shootings, kidnappings, and drug-related executions became more common, particularly in neighborhoods where both gangs had active members. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, and the FBI began to track both organizations closely, launching joint task forces to target gang members involved in interstate trafficking and violent crime. law enforcement responded with indictments and major federal operations. In 2012, several high-ranking ABT members were arrested and charged under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations (RICO) Act, along with charges related to drug trafficking and conspiracy to commit murder. Barrio Azteca also suffered a major blow when dozens of its members were indicted for racketeering, murder, and drug trafficking linked to cartel activity. By the late 2010s, the intensity of the gang war had declined due to these federal crackdowns, but the rivalry never truly ended. In many Texas prison units, both gangs remain active and dangerous. The conflict between the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas and Barrio Azteca serves as a stark reminder of how prison gangs have evolved into complex criminal networks with reach far beyond prison walls, capable of unleashing deadly violence in pursuit of power and profit. Number 4. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas versus Aryan Circle Gang. One of the most significant and violent internal conflicts within white supremacist prison gangs in Texas was the gang war between the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, ABT, and the Aryan Circle. Spanning from the late 1990s through the 2010s, this war was a brutal struggle for power, influence, and dominance, both inside Texas prisons and on the streets. What made this war unique was that it was not based on racial or ethnic divisions like many other prison rivalries, but rather on internal betrayal, leadership disputes, and competition for criminal profits. The Aryan Circle, AC, formed in the mid-1980s, originally splintered off from the ABT due to disagreements over the organization's structure and internal control. While both gangs shared similar ideologies rooted in white supremacy and criminal enterprise, their rivalry intensified as each group fought for dominance within the same territory: Texas prisons and the street-level drug trade. By the late 1990s, tensions had escalated between the two gangs. The ABT viewed the Aryan Circle as traitors and competition, while AC sought to expand its influence in units where the ABT had long held power. This led to a series of violent clashes in prisons, such as the Stiles Unit, Allred Unit, and Michael Unit, where both gangs had strong presences. Inmates were targeted for hits simply because of their allegiance to the rival group. Killings were carried out with makeshift weapons like shanks, sharpened metal rods, and prison-made knives. One of the key factors in the gang war was the drug trade. Both gangs were heavily involved in trafficking methamphetamine, heroin, and other narcotics within prisons and throughout Texas communities. Controlling drug routes, suppliers, and distribution points became a flashpoint for violence. The competition was not only about money, but also about reputation. Whoever controlled the drug flow controlled the power structure within the prison system. The conflict reached its peak during the 2000s, with dozens of assaults, attempted murders, and homicides linked directly to the ABT Aryan Circle feud. In one notable case, federal investigators uncovered plots by ABT members to assassinate key AC figures both inside and outside prison walls. Retaliatory strikes by Aryan Circle members followed, with each group escalating the violence through intimidation, planned hits, and retaliatory ambushes. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice, TDCJ, responded by increasing gang monitoring efforts and segregating known high-ranking members of both gangs. Special Security Threat Group, STG officers were assigned to track and intercept communication between members, and authorities often placed rival members in different housing units or facilities to reduce the chance of confrontation. Despite these efforts, the gang war continued for years, with its effects felt beyond prison. Members released on parole often carried the rivalry into the streets, particularly in cities like Houston, Fort Worth, and Waco, where both gangs had active street crews. Violent encounters, including shootings and drug-related murders, were often linked to the ongoing conflict between ABT and AC factions. By the late 2000s and 10s, several high-ranking members of both the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas and the Aryan Circle had been indicted on federal racketeering and conspiracy charges under the RICO Act. These prosecutions, along with increased pressure from law enforcement, led to a temporary decline in direct violence between the two gangs. However, the tension remains embedded in the structure of both organizations, with long-standing grudges and rivalries still simmering beneath the surface. The ABT Aryan Circle Gang War stands as a stark example of how internal power struggles and criminal enterprise can tear apart even ideologically similar organizations. It exposed the fragile alliances within white supremacist prison gangs and revealed the violent lengths to which these groups will go to protect their control and dominance in the criminal underworld. Number 3. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas versus Tango Blast Gang. The ongoing gang war between the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, ABT, and Tango Blast is one of the most dangerous and complex rivalries in the Texas prison system and the streets of major urban areas. Beginning in the early 2000s and continuing into the present day, the conflict represents a clash between a highly structured white supremacist gang and a loosely organized but rapidly expanding Hispanic street prison hybrid. Tango Blast, in contrast, is a relatively newer organization that began forming in the late 1990s and surged in numbers throughout the 2000s. Originally created as a form of protection for Hispanic inmates who did not want to join more structured gangs like the Mexican Mafia or Texas Syndicate, Tango Blast quickly evolved into a powerful force. Although less centralized than traditional prison gangs, its numbers grew rapidly, especially in cities like Houston, Dallas, Austin, and San Antonio, each with its own Tango clique, i.e.g. Houston, D-Town, ATX. By the early 2000s, Tango Blast's growth began threatening the dominance of older gangs inside Texas prisons, including the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas. While the ABT had long held power through violence and fear, the swelling ranks of Tango Blast made them a formidable adversary. Unlike the ABT, Tango Blast operated more like a street gang inside prisons, with fewer rules and a decentralized leadership structure that made it harder for authorities to infiltrate or disrupt. The gang war began with tensions over control of the drug trade inside high-security units such as the Allred Unit, Connolly Unit, and Estelle Unit. ABT members, known for their tight control over methamphetamine and heroin distribution, found themselves in direct conflict with Tango Blast members seeking access to the same revenue streams. Clashes escalated into violence, stabbings, beatings, and assaults carried out with shanks, locks and socks, and other improvised weapons. This war was not limited to racial lines. While the ABT maintained its white supremacist ideology, its primary concern was economic power and gang dominance. Tango Blast, being predominantly Hispanic, often responded to ABT's threats with overwhelming force, using their numbers to control cell blocks and challenge ABT's presence. Officers in TDCJ units began reporting increasing incidents of gang-on-gang violence, often sparked by disputes over contraband, debt collections, or perceived disrespect. Outside prison walls, the rivalry spilled into the streets of major Texas cities. In areas where both gangs had strong influence, drive-by shootings, armed robberies, and drug-related killings became more common. Law enforcement agencies such as the Texas Department of Public Safety and local gang units began tracking the conflict closely, identifying known ABT and Tango Blast members and trying to prevent retaliatory violence. One of the most dangerous aspects of this war is the adaptability of Tango Blast. Their loose organizational structure makes it difficult to monitor or target leaders, unlike the ABT, which has a defined hierarchy and documented patch system. Tango members blend easily into communities, often appearing more like typical street gang members than organized prison affiliates. Despite law enforcement crackdowns, the war continues. As of the 2020s, violence between ABT and Tango Blast persists, especially in facilities housing violent offenders and gang members. The battle for dominance in the Texas prison system remains fluid, with Tango Blast strength and numbers clashing against the Aryan Brotherhood structure and brutality. This conflict underscores the ever-evolving dynamics of gang power in Texas, where ideology, money, and survival collide in a dangerous struggle for control behind prison walls and on city streets. Number 2. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas versus Black Gangster Disciples Gang. During the 1990s, one of the most racially charged and violent gang rivalries in the Texas prison system emerged between the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, ABT, and the Black Gangster Disciples, BGDs. This conflict was fueled not only by competition over drugs and prison rackets, but also by deep-seated racial hatred and ideological divisions. The resulting violence claimed lives, destabilized entire prison units, and forced the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, TDCJ, to re-examine its approach to managing gang-affiliated inmates. On the other side were the Black Gangster Disciples, a faction of the larger Gangster Disciple Nation that originated in Chicago. By the 1990s, the Gangster Disciples had established a strong presence in the Texas prison system. Unlike ABT, the BGDs were rooted in a mixture of street-based gang culture and an organizational framework that included an ideology of uplift for black inmates, though in practice they were involved in the same criminal activities as other major prison gangs, including drug dealing, protection rackets, and assaults. The rivalry between ABT and the BGDs escalated in the early 1990s, sparked by competition for control over prison-based drug distribution and the racial tensions that defined much of the prison environment. ABT viewed black gangs as ideological enemies and criminal competitors. As the BGDs expanded their influence in key prison units, friction with ABT members turned increasingly violent. Prisons such as the Caulfield, Ramsey, and Ferguson units became hotspots for conflict. One major flashpoint occurred at the Caulfield unit in 1993, when a series of retaliatory stabbings between ABT and BGD members led to multiple lockdowns and the deaths of at least 2 inmates. These incidents were not isolated. Similar flare-ups occurred throughout the decade, particularly in high-security facilities that housed gang leaders and violent offenders. Racial divisions intensified the violence. ABT leaders often ordered attacks on black inmates affiliated with rival gangs, including the BGDs, simply to assert dominance and provoke fear. In turn, BGDs and their allies retaliated with their own ambushes and assaults. Violence ranged from brutal one-on-one attacks to coordinated group fights involving dozens of inmates. The tools of war included homemade weapons like shanks, razors, and weighted locks. TDCJ officials struggled to contain the violence. In response, prison authorities implemented a series of gang management strategies, including segregation of known ABT and BGD members, increased surveillance, and the creation of Security Threat Group, STG, monitoring units. Despite these efforts, the conflict persisted, fueled by the constant turnover of inmates, the decentralized nature of gang leadership, and the entrenched racial animosities within prison walls. The ABT versus BGD conflict also had consequences outside the prison system. Some affiliated members were paroled or released back into communities where they continued their gang activities. This often led to street-level violence in cities like Houston and Dallas, where both ABT and BGDs had active networks involved in drug trafficking and armed robberies. By the end of the 1990s, while some of the direct violence had diminished due to improved prison intelligence and tighter gang management, the legacy of the conflict remained. It revealed the deep racial fractures within the prison system and underscored the danger of prison gangs whose reach extended far beyond the cell block. The ABT-BGD gang war of the 1990s is remembered not only for its brutality, but also for how it forced the Texas prison system to evolve in the face of growing gang influence, racial conflict, and the deadly consequences of prison-based organized crime. Number 1. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas versus Mexican Mafia Gang. The violent rivalry between the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, ABT, and the Mexican Mafia, La M, throughout the 1990s and early 2000s stands as one of the most brutal gang wars in the history of Texas prisons. Fueled by racial hatred, competition over drug trafficking networks, and control of prison rackets, the conflict was marked by stabbings, assaults, and contract killings both inside correctional facilities and on the streets of Texas. Meanwhile, the Mexican Mafia, commonly referred to as La M, was a well-established Latino prison gang with origins dating back to the 1950s in California. By the 1990s, they had a significant presence in the Texas prison system and were major players in the narcotics trade, both inside and outside of prison. Their influence extended across racial and gang lines with a reputation for both brutality and organization. Tensions between the ABT and the Mexican Mafia had been brewing for years, but the 1990s saw an escalation due to overlapping criminal interests. At the heart of the conflict was control over lucrative rackets such as drug sales within prison walls, extortion of inmates, and influence over prison politics. Both gangs sought dominance, and neither was willing to share power. This gang war erupted in units such as the Hughes Unit, the Caulfield Unit, and the All Red Unit, prisons known for housing violent offenders and gang members. ABT soldiers launched coordinated attacks on suspected Mexican Mafia members, often using makeshift weapons such as shanks and blades fashioned from metal scraps. In response, La M orchestrated retaliation strikes that included ambushes, poisonings, and stabbing attacks of their own. One of the most violent years was 1998, when Texas Department of Criminal Justice, TDCJ officials, reported a significant spike in gang-related assaults attributed to the conflict. Correctional officers faced a daunting challenge trying to prevent violence, especially since both gangs operated under strict codes of silence and often communicated through coded letters, tattoos, and smuggled messages. The racial element of the conflict only added fuel to the fire. The ABT operated under white supremacist ideology, viewing the Mexican Mafia and other Latino gangs as racial enemies, not just criminal rivals. On the other hand, the Mexican Mafia, while focused on business and dominance rather than ideology, responded with equal ferocity to maintain control and protect their influence. Outside of prison, the war spilled into Texas cities like Houston, San Antonio, and Dallas. ABT and La M affiliates engaged in shootouts, home invasions, and drug-related murders. The battle for turf and trafficking routes led to a series of gangland assassinations and organized crime investigations by federal and state law enforcement. Ultimately, the intensity of the conflict forced the TDCJ and federal authorities to increase surveillance, intelligence gathering, and segregation of high-risk inmates. Many of the ABT's leaders were eventually indicted on federal charges under the RICO Act, while Mexican Mafia members also faced lengthy sentences. While the overt violence of the 1990s and early 2000s subsided somewhat in later years, the legacy of the war left a lasting impact on Texas prison policies, gang dynamics, and the ever-evolving landscape of organized crime in the state. This gang war remains a chilling example of how ideology, criminal enterprise, and prison conditions can converge to create a deadly and sustained conflict